I gotta be the very best!
Hello, fellow miners. Welcome to the second video in my series on how to be more successful at Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, my favorite roguelite survivor game. This series will cover a number of topics that will help you be more successful in your dives. It is intended for players who range from being relatively new with little hours played to more experienced players with lots of hours played. You should at least be familiar with the basic mechanics and gameplay prior to watching this video. For this video, I will be doing a deeper dive into stat buckets and damage types. The target audience are more experienced players, but newer players will learn something, and hopefully not be overwhelmed in the process. The content will be fairly detailed this time around, so be prepared for lots of numbers. If you want to learn even more, I suggest you join the DRG's Discord and ask questions, or drop a sub, as there is more to come in the series.
I fear the dwarf who has practiced one gun 1,000 times!
So what is a stat bucket? A stat bucket is just an aggregated collection of a particular stat of a particular type or source. Stat buckets are summed and then multiplied against each other bucket to give the final stat. In this example, we have 3 different types of percentage damage upgrades that affect the Thunderhead's damage, which is aggregated in the skill bucket for damage. The skill bucket here is 100% the initial plus each of the upgrades shown, which totals 160%. For weapons, stat buckets are seen on the weapon inspect screen, which lays out the stat calculations. The game does not show the stat buckets and calculations for character stats. Before we cover the anatomy of the stat calculation, we need to cover the different stat bucket types. There are 6 stat bucket types in the game, and they differ in various ways. In this table, we highlight the stat bucket name, in-game icon, type, percentage or fixed, in-game text color, blue or yellow, and the details associated with the stat bucket. Text color is used to denote additive or multiplicative stats. Blue is additive and yellow is multiplicative. You can see this in-game on all upgrades, artifacts, and overclocks, and even in the menus. This coloration is mostly true, except that the skill bucket for percentage stats is technically multiplicative, despite upgrades showing skill stats as blue, denoting them as additive. This is likely just a design choice to indicate to the player that blue text stats are in what you could call the common or basic bucket. The skill bucket is the bucket for percentage-based stats whose text color is blue. These stats are affected by upgrades and some artifacts. It is the primary bucket for your percentage upgrades that you select during a dive that is viewed as affecting a base value by a percentage. It is used for character stats such as movement speed and pickup radius, as well as for weapon stats, which includes all specific weapon level upgrades, weapon tag upgrades, and all weapon stat upgrades. The flat bucket is the bucket for fixed or numerical based stats whose text color is blue. These stats are affected by upgrades, meta, masteries, class mod modifiers, overclocks, and artifacts. This is specific for certain stats that affect a base value by a flat amount. It includes health, armor, life regen, luck, crit chance and damage, dodge, and some specific weapon stats like beam or drone count. The meta bucket is the bucket for your percentage-based stats from your meta, masteries, and class mod modifiers whose text color is yellow. This bucket is static during a dive and cannot be changed. The overclock bucket is the bucket for your percentage-based stats from your overclocks whose text color is yellow. This bucket is only for weapons and does not apply to character stats. The artifact bucket is the bucket for your percentage-based stats from your artifacts whose text color is yellow. This bucket is for artifacts and some passive abilities like the Juggernaut damage passive. The mutator bucket is the bucket for your percentage-based stats from the mutators for the current dive whose text color is yellow. This bucket is not shown on the weapon inspect screen unless you're doing a dive with mutators. For the final stat calculation, it is displayed in-game on the weapon inspect screen as the following: base value times skill plus flat times meta times overclock times artifact times mutator equals the stat. Each weapon will display this calculation repeated for each relevant stat. This calculation is somewhat confusing as it lists both skill and flat buckets being a distinct part of the calculation. However, percentage and flat upgrades are different, and you do not have stats that have both skill and flat upgrades, at least in the game currently. The better way to view this calculation is to break it out into one for percentage stats and one for flat stats. The weapon and spec screen allows you to see the stat calculations. However, the same is not true for character stats. There is no equivalent character and spec screen, but the calculation is the same. Let's do a quick example for movement speed to see how it's calculated. I'll show a series of screenshots where we track the upgrades and artifacts to show the calculation in final stat. Our base max meta movement speed shows at 16%, as I have not selected any movement speed upgrades yet. First, I select a rare 6% upgrade, which increases the movement speed by 7% to 23%. Then, I select an epic 9% upgrade, which increases the movement speed by 10% to 33%. Later, I take an uncommon 4% upgrade, which increases the movement speed by 5% to 38%. Shortly after, I am offered Ammo Rig from the supply pod, which reduces my movement speed by 15%. However, this shows a whopping decrease of 21% to 17%. Later, I take a legendary 12% upgrade, which increases the movement speed by 12% to 29%. So what happened here? Here is a stat calculation showing the value from start to finish, showing how the value is calculated with each change to the movement speed. The slightly larger initial increases are due to the meta bucket, the initial 16%, being on a separate multiplier. If you also notice, the decrease from the ammo rig is on the artifact bucket, as it should, so it reduces the bucket from 100% to 85%, which ends up being extremely impactful. Now let's take a look at the weapon and spec screen. The fact we have the weapon and spec screen means we can see changes to our stats in action as it displays the calculations right there. I'm not going to repeat the previous exercise, but I will highlight how impactful the different buckets are. Let's focus on the damage stat for the DRG here. Here we have a table showing the initial calculation as well as calculations where I reduce each bucket to 1, effectively removing it from the calculation, in the order of smallest bucket to largest bucket, or in the order of least impactful to most impactful in terms of damage reduction. You might then think that the skill bucket is more impactful and therefore you should want to increase it, but it's actually not. The artifact bucket is what you want to increase because it is currently smaller. This is counterintuitive at first, but this is just math and the power of multipliers. To demonstrate, let's take a look at increasing both buckets, starting with the skill bucket. We will add 10% to the bucket, up to 40%. We can see our damage increasing with it rising approximately 4.5% or 7 damage per projectile with each additional 10%. Adding 40% to the skill bucket has a net impact of 18.2% additional damage. Not bad, but let's look at the artifact bucket. We do the same exercise for the artifact bucket, adding 10% to the bucket up to 40%. We can see our damage increasing with it rising approximately 9.1% or 14 damage per projectile with each additional 10%. Adding 40% to the artifact bucket has a net impact of 36.4% additional damage, double the impact of the skill bucket. The take-home message is that increases to smaller buckets generally produce a larger impact compared to larger buckets. In any dive where you are leveling your weapons heavily and getting other upgrades, you tend to have very large skill buckets since it consists of your weapon level upgrades, weapon tag upgrades, and all stat upgrades. Your overclock and artifact buckets tend to be much smaller in comparison since those buckets can only be increased through overclocks and artifacts respectively. In summary, stat buckets are the aggregation of stats by a type or source. The buckets are multiplied against each other to get final stats. Larger buckets yield larger stats. Since overclock and artifact buckets are separate from the skill bucket, the upgrades, they are hugely impactful, especially considering they tend to be smaller. In other words, stats go brrr when buckets go brrr. And now a quick word from our sponsor.
Come on down to Darcy's Diner for Dwarves, the cheapest food this side of Hawks is, open 24 hours. Try our lunch combo of sandwich and pretzel for only 14,999 credits. Bringing evidence of a completed mission for a free cookie while supplies last.
Thank you, Darcy. We appreciate your sponsorship.
I'll be the real drunken master!
So what are the damage types? There are 2 damage types in the game, on-hit damage and status effect damage. On-hit damage is the direct damage done when your weapon contacts a bug. This includes the lingering attacks like the coils from the coil gun, or ground zone attacks like from Sludge Pump or the Krakatoa Protocol Unstable Overclock. Status effect damage is the indirect damage done when the elemental weapon hits a bug. This includes weapons that apply a status effect but do not share the elemental tag directly, such as the various burn or shock overclocks or acid or fire overclocks for the impact axes. For the purposes of this video, consider these weapons as basically having the elemental tag when talking about status effect damage. One thing to note is that all elemental damage and potency upgrades do not affect the potency or the on-hit damage of these elemental tagless weapons, just the status effect damage. During a dive, the game generally differentiates damage by way of small text for on-hit damage going up away from the bug being damaged, with bold, larger text for crits, and small text for status effect damage going down away from the bug being damaged. These numbers are toggled in the settings, where you have separate settings for damage numbers and damage over time numbers for on-hit and status effect damage respectively. Note that the Wave Cooker and some overclocks do not follow this damage type text rule. Their on-hit damage shows as damage over time due to their unique damage mechanics. In general though, you should expect this text behavior that indicates damage type to hold true for almost all weapons. In this example with the Sludge Pump, it is very obvious as the on-hit damage is only 1 to 2 digits, while the status effect damage is 4 digits. Additionally, on-hit damage is very clear in the game, as the on-hit damage is the damage displayed on the mission complete screen and weapon inspect screen. This stems from the damage calculation shown on the weapon inspect screen, which is for on-hit damage only. Status effect damage is not as clear, partly because the game doesn't present a clear total of status effect damage dealt and the status effect damage calculation. You can infer status effect damage by taking the total elemental damage dealt and subtracting the on-hit damage shown. However, this can be difficult when you have multiple weapons of the same element or if your weapon changed element mid-dive. So how does status effect damage actually work then? Hits of an elemental weapon, acid, electrical, or fire, apply stacks of said element based on the potency of the weapon. More hits apply more stacks, and more potency will increase the number of stacks applied per hit. Status effect damage is sometimes called damage over time or DOT, as it is a lasting effect. The damaging effect itself is generally referred to as the ticks of damage, like the ticks of a clock. The more stacks on the target, the larger each tick of damage will be, and ticks occur every 0.5 seconds. These stacks fall off over time, specifically 20% of total stacks with each tick, until there are less than 2 stacks, at which point they are zeroed out or removed, unless you continue to hit the target and apply stacks. Since we are on the topic of status effect damage, I want to briefly cover the elemental specific mechanics of each element. In this table, you will find the base tick damage per stack, the status effect name, and details of the mechanics. Acid increases the damage taken from all sources based on the stack count at 1% per stack up to 100% or 100 stacks. This also increases status effect damage, including the corrode itself. You can still have more than 100 stacks on a target, they just don't count for the additional damage bonus. This damage scales multiplicatively, and bugs that die while corroded transfer a small amount of stacks to nearby bugs. Electrical increases the chance to crit based on the stack count at 0.5% per stack up to 100% or 200 stacks. Like acid, you can have more than 200 stacks on a target, they just don't count for the additional crit. This additional crit scales additively, so it is just added on top of your existing crit chance. The Electrocute status effect is not like corrode or burn, where it ticks against a single target only. Electrocuted bugs require a nearby bug for the status effect to tick and deal damage, where the status effect arcs or jumps to the nearby bug. This arcing transfers the remaining stacks to the new bug, and the electrocution continues arcing as long as there are bugs in range. Fire has no special mechanic like acid and electrical. Fire just has a higher base damage at double or 100% more compared to acid and electrical. With on-hit damage and status effect damage defined, what upgrades affect these damage types? Here I have listed every upgrade type, the icons, upgrade name, and whether it affects on-hit damage, status effect damage, or both. It is important to note that both specific weapon damage, upgrades that level weapons, and weapon tag damage, upgrades that affect all weapons of a specific tag, excluding elemental, do not affect status effect damage. Only the all damage upgrades, named body shots, and the elemental tag damage upgrades that increase element damage and potency, named bigger cogs, affect status effect damage. Note that crit chance and damage increase your on-hit damage, but its effect is applied after a hit occurs, so you do not see this in your weapon inspect screen damage calculation. Also note that potency does not increase the per stack damage, but the number of stacks that are applied per hit, which does increase the status effect damage overall per tick. The previous slide covered upgrades from leveling, upgrades that are purchased from the shop, and upgrades from loot crates. But what else affects damage? Here I have listed every other source and whether it affects on-hit damage, status effect damage, or both. All damage, meta, masteries, and class mod modifiers affect both. There is currently only one tag-specific class mod modifier for damage in the game, which is for Maintenance Worker Engineer. It only affects on-hit damage. Weapon masteries that increase damage for the weapon itself only affect on-hit damage. Weapon masteries that increase potency for the weapon of course affects your status effect damage. Damage overclocks only affect on-hit damage. For the sidearm overclock, this applies to the weapon with the overclock and all your other weapons. Potency overclocks only affect status effect damage. And finally, the most important point, damage artifacts affect both on-hit and status effect damage. Most artifacts increase your damage, but I want to briefly mention one that doesn't. Squinties, otherwise known as the goggles, applies minus 30% damage. This downside affects both your on-hit damage and your status effect damage, while the crit chance and damage only affect your on-hit damage. Therefore, the goggles should never be picked if you are building heavy status effect damage. In summary, on-hit damage is the direct damage done by your weapon, contacting bugs, and status effect damage is the indirect damage by the hits from your acid, electrical, and fire weapons. Hits from the elemental weapons apply stacks, and potency affects the number of stacks applied per hit. More potency equals more stacks equals more damage. Damage for each type is affected differently depending on the stats, upgrades, and source. You don't need to memorize the previous tables. A good shortcut to determine if a damage increase affects status effect damage is to ask, how does this upgrade affect my weapons? Upgrades that affect all of your weapons regardless of tags, or upgrades that affect all acid, electrical, or fire weapons will increase status effect damage. That concludes the second video in my series on how to be more successful at Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you haven't watched part 1, you can find a link in the description or by browsing my YouTube page. Part 3 should be coming very soon, which will cover artifact and upgrade selections. If you have questions or feedback, drop a comment below, or feel free to ping me on the DRGS Discord. I'm the Hardcore Nutjob Guy. Thank you. I'd also like to give a special thank you to my fellow miners on the Discord who gave me feedback and advice for this video, as well as having been my original source for much of the details I covered. Rockin' Stone.
What's that beeping sound? There's a beeping sound, miner. That's probably not good.